Ladies and gentlemen, let's be crystal clear about the situation unfolding in Ouagadougou. The events in Burkina Faso weren't some idle gossip, they weren't trending topics fueled by social media bots, and this certainly isn't political hyperbole. The conspiracy to overthrow President Ibrahim Traore was a tangible, imminent threat, deadly serious and terrifyingly close to getting the green light for execution. Confirmation didn't come through back channels, it came straight from the source. Multiple suspects appeared on national broadcasts, delivering detailed confessions that left nothing to the imagination. They didn't mince words, they named specific names. These weren't vague admissions. They laid out the entire blueprint, the cash flow, the weapons caches, the drop zones, the specific communication apps used, and the tactical maneuvers. That level of specificity speaks volumes. We are past the point of speculation or state-sponsored propaganda. This was a bona fide military operation that had graduated from the drawing board to the field. The testimony paints a chilling picture of a plot in its 11th hour. The funding had already changed hands, greasing the wheels for what was to come. Hardware had been transported to strategic positions. Clandestine meetings were concluded. The hit list was finalized with specific targets marked for assassination. Let that sink in. We aren't talking about a hypothetical scenario that might have played out next year. This machinery was in motion and set to strike within a matter of hours. If intelligence services had reacted even a fraction of a second too late, the sun would have risen over a Burkina Faso plunged into absolute anarchy, mass violence, and yet another shattered dream. What has truly rattled observers across the African continent isn't just the betrayal, but the sheer granular level of detail that has come to light. The plotters didn't hold back, describing their use of end-to-end encrypted platforms like Signal and Zangi. They identified safe houses scattered throughout West Africa and detailed their strategy to neutralize the nation's air superiority before the first shot was fired. Getting a confession. This comprehensive is incredibly rare in the world of intelligence. It proves the state didn't just avert a disaster, they completely dismantled the infrastructure behind it. For the youth across the continent watching this unfold on their screens, this moment served as a harsh, cold splash of water to the face. It is undeniable proof that shadow forces are burning the midnight oil, working tirelessly to roll back African-led sovereignty. But it also proved a critical counterpoint. This time, the bad guys missed. Their failure stems from a fatal miscalculation. The system they assumed was asleep at the wheel was actually wide awake and watching. The biggest takeaway from this botched operation is that we aren't dealing with a lone wolf scenario or a handful of disgruntled grunts in the barracks. The evidence exposes a sprawling, complex web. We're talking about high-ranking military brass civilian business tycoons, money launderers, handlers stationed abroad, and deep-pocketed foreign backers. Put simply, this wasn't a random occurrence. It was a systemic engineered attempt at regime change. The testimonies broke down the corporate structure of the coup, explaining exactly how roles were compartmentalized and assigned. You had teams dedicated to comms, others managing the finances, logistics, crews, moving heavy weaponry, hit squads prepped for wet work, and couriers shuffling messages across borders. That level of synchronization doesn't just materialize out of thin air. It requires months of trust-building, meticulous planning, and patience. It suggests this cancer has been metastasizing in the dark for years. But the most disturbing aspect is that the call was coming from inside the house. These weren't foreign mercenaries scaling the walls. These were insiders, men wearing the national uniform, holding security clearances, and walking through the front doors of sensitive facilities. They knew the system's heartbeat because they were part of it. That's why the threat level was critical. Betrayal from the inner circle is always harder to spot and infinitely more devastating. Then comes the geopolitical bombshell, the transnational scope of this network. The trail of evidence leads directly into Togo, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. This confirms that the operation wasn't just an internal dispute within Burkina Faso's borders. This was a strategic move in a larger game to set the Sahel region on fire and derail the sovereignty movement that these nations are fighting to establish. For the average citizen on the street, this information has completely shifted the narrative. The skepticism is gone. Nobody is asking if the plot was real anymore. Now, the terrifying question echoing from the capital to the villages is, how many more sleeper cells are out there waiting for a signal? But what hits home the hardest for millions of Africans isn't just the physical danger, it's the identity of the architects behind the chaos. The very people trying to strangle this revolution in its crib are from the same generation that failed the continent decades ago. We are looking at the same elite class that stood by and said nothing when visionaries like Thomas Sankara were silenced. They had their shot to build robust independent nations. Instead, they constructed monuments to corruption, fostered dependency, and ruled through fear. Now in 2026, history is trying to rhyme, but the script has flipped. The youth are wide awake. They see clearly that the old guard isn't fighting for democracy or stability. It's a desperate clawback for power. They are fighting to reclaim the VIP access and privileges they feel entitled to. They are seething with resentment that a young upstart like Ibrahim Traore ascended to leadership without kissing the ring. They can't stomach a new system that prioritizes loyalty, sacrifice, and actual results over seniority and foreign Rolodexes. That is why this feels less like politics and more like a generational war. In one corner, you have the decaying remnants of the old order tethered to backroom deals in Paris and the politics of exile. In the opposing corner stands a rising generation that is demanding total sovereignty, national dignity, and the right to pilot their own destiny. This botched coup wasn't merely an attempt to take out a president. It was an assault on an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. You can throw men in cells, but you can't incarcerate a concept. That's why this failure is so pivotal. It proves the old playbook is obsolete. The younger demographic is watching every move, taking notes, and making very different choices than their predecessors. Standing at ground zero of this entire conspiracy is one-man former President Paul-Henri Damiba. Intelligence reports and confessions pinpoint him not as a reluctant participant, but as the nexus. He wasn't leading a popular movement or inspiring the masses. Instead, he was pulling the strings from exile primarily out of Togo, utilizing encrypted channels and leveraging personal vendettas. Damiba's strategy wasn't political, it was cold calculated and deeply personal. When you analyze the rhetoric coming from the former leader, it becomes immediately apparent that he wasn't offering a roadmap for the future of Burkina Faso. Instead, he was doubling down on grievances, harping on resentment, and amplifying the complaints of officers who felt their paychecks were too light and their egos too bruised. This wasn't a recruitment drive based on vision or policy. This was headhunting based on vulnerability. He didn't build this coalition on a shared ideology or a patriotic dream, but rather on raw emotion and bitterness, which ultimately created a network that was structurally unsound. From day one, relying exclusively on his old Rolodex from his days in the presidential palace. It was a logistical operation that looked more like a cartel than a military movement, using local merchants to launder funds, turning everyday civilians into bagmen for illicit messages and reducing trained soldiers to mere pawns in a game of power. This was the furthest thing from actual leadership. It was textbook manipulation, pure and simple, and because there was no foundational belief system holding them together, the loyalty of the co-conspirators had an expiration date exactly matching the moment the cash stopped flowing. That lack of cohesion explains precisely why this entire house of cards collapsed the second the intelligence community started tightening the net. There was no brotherhood, no band of brothers bond to withstand the pressure. Every single player in this game was looking out for number one, with reports surfacing that some insiders were actually skimming off the top and stealing from the very coup funds they were supposed to be managing. That is simply not how successful revolutions are born or sustained. And Damiba's involvement here shines a spotlight on a very painful reality for the opposition. You cannot topple a system that has boots on the ground support by relying on exile politics fueled by foreign cash and personal vendettas. The old playbook of throwing money at a problem clearly failed miserably in 2026. As the confession tapes began rolling on national television, one fact became undeniable. To every viewer, watching this attempted takeover had absolutely nothing to do with patriotism, national duty, or political ideology. It was entirely a mercenary operation driven by cold, hard cash, with massive sums being smuggled across borders, specifically originating from the Ivory Coast and then filtered into the hands of operatives inside Burkina Faso. Federal investigators have now connected the dots, revealing that a staggering 70 million CFA francs were funneled into this operation to grease the wheels. That money was the fuel for a machine built on buying silence, purchasing loyalty, procuring black market weapons, and putting hits out on specific targets. But the second that dirty money entered the equation, the entire mission was compromised. The focus shifted immediately from tactical strategy to financial payout, with operatives stopping to ask, "What's my cut?" rather than "What's the objective?" Everyone involved wanted a piece of the pie, with soldiers who had sworn oaths to protect the nation suddenly running the numbers on how much profit they could extract from betraying it. Even the civilians acting as couriers weren't driven by a desire for political change. They were strictly in it for the thick envelopes of cash being handed to them under the table. This distinction is critical because history teaches us that genuine revolutions are built on the bedrock of belief, where individuals are willing to risk everything for a cause greater than their own bank accounts. But in this scenario, the moment the funding pipeline hit a snag or a payment was delayed, the trust evaporated instantly, proving just how fragile purchase loyalty really is. As the pressure mounted, greed was quickly replaced by paranoia and fear, which is exactly why the network disintegrated so rapidly once the intelligence services ramped up their surveillance. You can write a check for action, but you cannot buy courage, and you certainly cannot buy unity. This plot was completely soulless and offered zero message or hope to the general public. That creates a vacuum of support, explaining why the streets remained quiet, with no protests and no public backing. It was a silent conspiracy of a few individuals hoping to catch a windfall of power overnight. When the dust settled, the money trail revealed the ugly truth: this operation was never about saving Burkina Faso from a crisis. It was a grift, plain and simple, focused on personal enrichment, and, if history is any guide, coups built on the foundation of greed are destined to self-destruct every single time. Perhaps the most humiliating aspect of this entire debacle isn't just the failure of the mission, but the sheer incompetence and absurdity of how it fell apart. We are talking about a group of conspirators who couldn't even maintain honor among thieves, with operative funds being pilfered by the very lieutenants entrusted to execute the plan. High-ranking officers were reportedly pocketing cash for their own personal expenses, causing operational delays as the group bickered and argued over missing payments. In one of the most bizarre details to emerge, reports indicate a captain actually diverted a chunk of the coup funding to pay for his own upcoming wedding. You really cannot make this stuff up. Think about the mindset required to plan a high-stakes political assassination with one hand while booking a wedding band and fitting a tuxedo with the other. It perfectly illustrates the complete lack of a moral compass within this network. They lacked focus and discipline, allowing themselves to be distracted by the trappings of comfort, personal pleasure, and social status, rather than the mission at hand. This internal rot and corruption made the job of the intelligence agencies significantly easier, because when people are busy stealing from each other, they get sloppy, they talk too much, and they leave a paper trail a mile wide. Their need to launder and spend the money forced them to expand their circle, creating more points of failure, and raising red flags that security services picked up on, immediately watching silently as the network implicated itself. There is a powerful lesson to be learned here. For any observer of global politics, corruption is not just a moral failing, it is a strategic liability. It is reckless and dangerous, rendering covert operations impossible to keep secret, effectively causing the conspirators to destroy their own plot before the government even had to lift a finger. Ironically, their own insatiable greed ended up being the savior of the nation, because while they were preoccupied with ripping each other off, the intelligence apparatus was documenting every single move they made. By the time the authorities finally swooped in to make arrests, they didn't just have leads. They had the entire blueprint of the conspiracy mapped out in high definition. However, despite the incompetence, we cannot ignore that at the core of this plan was a deadly serious objective: the targeted elimination of the drone program's commander. The plotters, despite their flaws, correctly identified that air superiority and drone warfare are the absolute backbone of Burkina Faso's military dominance in the current conflict landscape. These unmanned aerial vehicles have completely revolutionized the battlefield, providing real-time surveillance to protect troops and executing precision strikes that neutralize enemies while sparing civilian lives. The strategy was to decapitate the drone command structure, effectively blinding the state's defense apparatus and leaving ground forces exposed without their eye in the sky. The calculation was that removing this key asset would create a vulnerability large enough to allow armed insurgent units to storm the capital virtually undetected. It was a chillingly cold and calculated military strategy, and what makes it truly terrifying is how casually these plans were discussed by the men involved. Wiretaps and phone intercepts captured conversations filled with laughter and arrogance, showing men plotting a murder with the same emotional detachment one might have when planning a lunch order. This highlights the extreme danger of the insider threat. Betrayal from within the ranks is always more devastating than an external attack. When you have an individual who knows the system inside and out, and they make the conscious choice to tear it down, the potential for catastrophic damage is off the charts, which is why these arrests were so pivotal. By intercepting this plot and preventing that assassination, the security services didn't just save the life of one officer. They preserved the delicate security architecture of the entire nation. The declassification of this plot reveals a terrifying reality. Ouagadougou was standing on the precipice of total catastrophe. It highlights just how vital, precise real-time intelligence gathering was in pulling the nation back from the brink at the 11th hour. But perhaps the most jarring bombshell to drop from this investigation is the origin of the firepower. These weren't arms smuggled across the border by foreign runners. The hardware came straight from the government's own armories. We are talking about a high-ranking, non-commissioned officer leveraging his security clearance to traffic heavy machine guns and crates of ammunition right through the heart of the capital, completely under the radar. This development validates a nightmare scenario that keeps security analysts and citizens across the African continent awake at night. It proves that the call is coming from inside the house. Because the perpetrator was wearing the uniform and flashing the right credentials, he bypassed every checkpoint and protocol without raising a single eyebrow. It is a textbook definition of a breach of trust. The very arsenal procured to defend the Republic was nearly turned against it to burn the institutions to the ground. However, this specific failure of protocol shines a spotlight on the sophisticated capabilities of the counterintelligence units. These agents didn't go in guns blazing on a hunch. They played the long game. They monitored the transit of every rifle, geolocated every drop-off point, and clocked the operational timeline down to the second. They held their fire until the absolute point of no return. When the takedown finally happened, the suspects were caught red-handed with the hardware, the illicit financing, and the operational blueprints right on the table. It was a slam-dunk case. The evidence of treason was irrefutable, forcing the entire nation to grapple with a harsh reality check. The stars on a shoulder board mean nothing if the heart isn't loyal to the flag. Unchecked access combined with wavering allegiance is a recipe for disaster, and this wake-up call is currently fueling a massive structural overhaul within the military hierarchy. Observers are only just starting to grasp the magnitude of this operation. The Burkinabe intelligence apparatus wasn't scrambling in crisis mode or reacting out of fear. The reality is far more impressive. They had already penetrated the inner circle of the plotters. For weeks leading up to the bust, the agency had eyes on the clandestine meetings, the flow of dark money, the weapon caches, and the specific dossier of every traitor involved. This wasn't a lucky break, it was masterful tradecraft. Rather than jumping the gun and making premature arrests, the government made a calculated gamble. They chose to maintain surveillance, wiretap communications, and shadow every move from the shadows. They gave the conspirators enough rope to hang themselves, allowing the entire seditious network to reveal its full scope and scale. This strategy demands nerves of steel, because moving too soon on a coup attempt often means the puppet masters and foreign financiers slip away into the night. By the time late December rolled around, reports indicate that intelligence case officers had locked down the precise coordinates, the 0-hour timestamps, and the complete roster of participants. They had a map of every handshake and secret rendezvous, the transit routes of the armaments, and they were fully briefed on the grisly details of the assassination plots targeting leadership. You don't get that kind of situational awareness by accident. That is the direct result of deep cover infiltration and persistent surveillance, which explains the surgical precision of the takedown. We didn't see chaotic raids or dragnet sweeps of neighborhoods. The ringleaders were extracted at the precise second when the evidentiary case against them was bulletproof. This tactic guaranteed that the subsequent confessions would be comprehensive and impossible to recant. For observers across the region, this operation has fundamentally shifted the perception of state capacity. It demonstrates that the security apparatus is neither fragile nor dormant. It is an evolving organism that is learning from past failures and adapting to modern threats. It has proven it can defend the Constitution with quiet competence and high-level intellect. If you want the real story, just look at the timestamp of the raids. Tactical teams breached the safe houses roughly 60 minutes before the coup was scheduled to launch. That is not a coincidence. That is superior strategic dominance. By holding the line until the final countdown, the government ensured the plot was fully operational, heavily funded, armed to the teeth, and completely undeniable in a court of law. At that stage of execution, plausible deniability is dead. No one can claim they were just venting or engaging in theoretical discussions. The guns were racked, the bribes were bagged, the convoys were rolling, and the attack orders were signed. The steel traps snapped shut exactly when the case was airtight. This high-stakes methodology hit two birds with one stone. It neutralized the threat without a firefight, and it illuminated the entire web of conspirators, including their foreign handlers. A premature bust would have allowed the shadowbackers to cut ties and vanish. Patience allowed the intelligence community to map the entire genome of the insurrection. That is precisely why the interrogations yielded such granular details. The suspects realized immediately that the authorities held all the cards, making denial completely futile. Cooperation became their only play for leniency, while silence would only deepen their incrimination in the eyes of the public. It was a watershed moment for the administration. It proved that the government wasn't making things up as they went along. They were executing a master plan. That sends a chilling message to any other would-be usurpers thinking about taking a shot at the throne. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this entire affair is the confirmation that this was not an isolated domestic incident contained within Burkina Faso's borders. The tentacles of this conspiracy reached deep into neighboring territories, specifically implicating networks in Togo, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast. Illicit funds, encrypted comms, and tactical coordination were all flowing through this cross-border pipeline, exposing a systemic cancer growing in the West African geopolitical landscape. We are witnessing the regionalization of political instability. A putsch in one capital sends shockwaves through the bloc, and disenfranchised power players are increasingly seeking sanctuary and sponsorship next door. The transcripts from the interrogations have pulled back the curtain on the dark mechanics of exile politics. Deposed elites are utilizing adjacent nations as staging grounds, leveraging digital infrastructure to command operations and laundering capital to exploit diplomatic blind spots. This dynamic is ratcheting up diplomatic tensions to a breaking point and forcing citizens across the continent to ask some uncomfortable questions about sovereignty and cooperation. Will these host nations hand over the architects of chaos, or will they continue to shield these fugitives behind the thin veil of diplomatic protocol? How this question is answered will define the trajectory of West African unity for the next decade. The stakes have risen far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It is fundamentally about whether the continent has the resolve to safeguard its own political evolution from internal and external sabotage. While the traitors were broadcasting their guilt on national television, a quiet but profound transformation was taking place in the background. A new generation of leadership was stepping up. Battle-hardened warriors who forged their reputation in the fire of combat were being promoted to command. The image speaks volumes, the corrupt old guard begging for mercy while the new vanguard prepares to lead. We are witnessing a definitive passing of the torch today as a rising generation of leaders is finally being entrusted with the reins of real responsibility. Make no mistake, this development stands as the single most undeniable indicator that a profound generational shift is fully underway. The center of political gravity is clearly shifting before our eyes. We are watching power being stripped away from those entrenched networks defined by decades of graft and allegiance to foreign powers. In their place, authority is transferring to battle-tested individuals who have proven their worth through grit and results right here on the ground. The implications of this moment for youth across the African continent simply cannot be overstated. It sends a resounding, crystal-clear message that selling out one's country results in absolute disgrace rather than a payout. And conversely, that steadfast loyalty and dedicated public service remain the true path to the highest levels of national leadership. Looking back at that thwarted insurrection, we must recognize that the failed coup represents something far greater than a mere tactical win for the security forces involved. It stands as a monumental symbolic victory that resonates far beyond the immediate restoration of law and order. This event has effectively exposed the reality that the old authoritarian playbook is completely obsolete. The dark era of shady backroom power, grabs, and plotting regimes from exile is finally taking its last breath. Now, while a revitalized African future is certainly not a guaranteed outcome, the machinery of the past is undeniably broken. However, When we witness history pivoting like this, it provides us with concrete proof that a different future is absolutely within reach. It validates the enduring hope that real transformation is not just a dream, but a distinct and achievable possibility.